time, Professor Harman, to start the discussion. Before I start the discussion, I will inform the audience about the rundown of our discussion tonight. The discussion will begin by I will introduce two of our speakers. The first, it will be Professor Harman himself. Professor Harman, you will have 25 minutes to talk about your concept on OOO.
How many
25 minutes? 25 minutes. Yeah, 25 minutes and 30 maximum. And my colleague, Fahri Afif, he will give some commentaries on your explanation, on your presentation for the next 20 minutes. And after that, we will discuss your ideas, your key concept on OOO for at least 40 minutes. So there will be questions, there will be answer either from you or my friend, and also you also open to ask questions or even give some commentaries on the opinion or the discussion that was held in the next sessions. So without any delay anymore, I will read some opening, some introduction before you start to presenting your idea, Professor Harman. So my Indonesian audience, my friend, my colleagues, the 21st century opened stage for continental philosophy. In an arena of tired of old echoes, fresh players suddenly emerge, beating the drum under the name speculative realism. This movement was initiated by four philosophers who became the focal point of the debate: Professor Harman himself, Kwangtong Measu, Ray Brazier, and Ian Hamilton Grant. They first announced their presence in 27 at a workshop at Goldsmiths, University of London. If I'm not mistaken, Professor Harman, it was a small gathering, but later shake up the larger jargon. But ladies and gentlemen, my friend, don't imagine them as the founders of a church with tidy doctrines. There is no single creed, no holy book. All they have is a common enemy: the rigidity of relationism. The claim that philosophy since Kant has ceased to speak directly about reality itself and relies on the relationship between an experience. Speculative realism seeks to break the power of correlationism, opening up the possibility of thinking about reality beyond a mere reflection of human consciousness. So, without any further ado, Professor Harman, you have 25 minutes to present the idea.
Right. Let me begin by, I know that some of you are quite familiar with object-oriented ontology, but some maybe not so much. So I will assume no prior knowledge, and I will simply start with the basics. I know some of you are familiar with the book, The Quadruple Object. Well, of course, the quadruple object implies that there are four poles of reality, and that's not new. There have been philosophies in both West and East throughout the history of philosophy that have had fourfold structures. And from the pre-Socratic Greeks to China, to everything in between, there have been fourfold structures. When you look at these, what you find is that there are two dualisms that are creating the four, usually. It's just a question of what those are. In the case of object-oriented ontology, the first dualism, which is a very familiar one, the difference between that which was withdrawn and that which is directly accessible. And this is not original to object-oriented ontology, of course. You find this in Kant's Thing in Itself and Phenomena. You find it in Heidegger's 200 and 400 or ready to hand, present at hand. So that's not especially new. That's simply something that I would say Kant brought into Western philosophy in the 1780s with his idea of the thing in itself. And there have been, in many ways, the thing in itself has been very unpopular in Western philosophy. For instance, the German idealists after Kant, as deeply though they admired Kant, thought that it was a contradiction to say that there's a thing outside thoughts. Because if I say that, then I'm already thinking it, of course. So therefore, it's a thought. And then you have Fichte and Hegel taking things in that direction. In the 20th century, you have Husserl's phenomenology, which also rejects the thing in itself. Because Husserl says, how could the real Berlin be different from the Berlin that I'm thinking about? Then there would be an impossibility of trying to link those two Berlins, the Berlin that's in my mind and the Berlin that exists in the real world. And so for Husserl, that was enough to disqualify the thing in itself. And so there is nothing for Husserl that cannot, at least in principle, be the object of a mental act, an intentional act, as he calls it. Well, my philosophical education was very intensely under the works of Heidegger, for all his faults, probably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And for Heidegger, of course, the rejection of the thing in itself is not valid, because for Heidegger, the existence of something as a mental object is quite secondary. Our primary relation to the world consists in taking it for granted, in using it, in not being conscious of it. And it's only in rare cases that we are conscious of it. And so my doctoral dissertation, which became my first book, Tool Being, is all about the way that tools hide. They withdraw, in Heidegger's term, and then they can sometimes become partly visible when they break. This is the argument of tool being. There are a couple of things about Heidegger's analysis that bother me, though, that I've written about in my book. The first one is Heidegger talks about how all tools belong in a system when they're working. And when they're working, this is true, right? Because yes, I'm sitting in this chair, but this chair in turn is defined by the fact that I am sitting in a chair in order to give this lecture on Zoom to Indonesia from Los Angeles.
Mr.
What's that? Oh,
I think, yeah, that there is, an error. You can continue, Professor Herman,
right.
please.
Sure. And so you end up with all tools in a system. Every tool takes its meaning from all the other for Heidegger. The problem with this is that it does not take account of the fact that, well, Heidegger also realizes tools break, but when tools break, they are not fully linked into the system. So if you have a hammer and you're hammering and it's working properly and it's hitting the nails like it's supposed to, that's the tool system, where the hammer refers to the nail and the nail refers to the wood refers to the whole house, the house refers to my desire to buy a house and live in it. But when things break, that's when something comes from outside the system. So in this case, the hammer was much weaker than we realized, so it shatters in my hands. The hammer is broken. Well, that's only possible because part of the hammer was not inscribed in the system. And so Heidegger was wrong to talk entirely about the system here. Each individual object that's part of the tool system has something more that's not in the system, and that's why it's able to break. And so a system is always going to oversimplify all of the tools that are in it. They always have a deeper reality that is not fully expressed in whatever they are doing right now. There needs to be something external to the system. And just in passing, this idea, I realized later, actually goes all the way back to Aristotle in the Metaphysics, when Aristotle is discussing a group of his enemies, the Megarians, a group of philosophers from Megara, which is not too far from Athens. The city of Megara is still there. I passed through it on the train. It was a funny moment. The Megarians say that a thing is only whatever it is doing right now. And so they famously claimed no one is a house builder unless they are building a house in this very moment. Okay? And this links in contemporary philosophy with Bruno Latour, who's meant a lot to me also, actor network theory, the idea that a thing is only what it's doing. This could also be linked with American pragmatism, which Latour was highly influenced by. But it goes all the way back to the Megarians in ancient Greece. And as Aristotle pointed out way back then, the problem is, what about a master house builder who stops building and goes to sleep? Have they completely lost the ability to, have they completely lost their house building characteristics? And then if they did, how do they regain those house building characteristics if they start building again? With the point being that there must be such a thing that exists even when it is not acting, the house building qualities, the house building abilities. And this is what Aristotle goes on to call potential, one of his famous contributions to philosophy. A thing is not just what it actually is, a thing is also its potential. It has some reality in it that is not currently expressed. And I've also used the term dormant object for this. There can be an object that exists that is not currently interacting with anything. It might interact with something in the future, or it might not. There might be some objects that never enter into relation with anything else, and so they are never detected. So anyway, I don't want to put too much detail on that. I just wanted to say that this is the first but only the first idea of object-oriented ontology, that reality is never fully expressed in any of its relations. When I look at a thing, I'm not seeing the whole depths of the thing. I'm exaggerating, I'm oversimplifying the thing, I'm creating a caricature of the thing. I'm never going to get it quite right. So even the greatest science of nature, say Einstein's theory of gravity right now, is not getting gravity completely right. We know there will be future revolutions in the history of science. We will find that Einstein was wrong about some things. He was more right than Newton, we think now, but he probably will turn out to be wrong because, for example, we can't make gravity compatible with quantum theory yet, so there's a problem there. We know there will be further developments in the future in the theory of gravity. What this means is that at any moment in the history of science, in the history of human knowledge, there is a gap between what we know and what reality is. That gap is permanent. We cannot get rid of that gap. And this is the refutation of any form of rationalism, the idea that we can simply know reality directly as it is, as Edmund Husserl thought, for instance. All right, that's one issue I have with Heidegger's tool analysis. The other issue is, for Heidegger, the human being is always in the center. Dasein, his German word. The human being is always in the center of it. So when I look, here's this water bottle. I'm looking at this water bottle. I'm oversimplifying it with my human perceptual skills. Heidegger, much like Kant, thinks that is something that the human mind does. The human mind has this unique failure to grasp reality. For Kant, we are trapped in the finitude of space-time and the 12 categories of understanding. For Heidegger, we are trapped in the finitude of human Dasein. What neither of them really recognizes is that objects do this to each other as well. And this brings us back to pre-modern philosophy, because it was only with Kant in Western philosophy that the human world relation became the center of all philosophy. So for Kant, I cannot talk about fire burning cotton. I can only talk about the human perception of fire burning cotton. Since I am not fire and I am not cotton, I am trapped in human finitude. I have to only talk about what the conditions of human access are to the incident of fire burning cotton. Now, interestingly, fire burning cotton was the favorite example of medieval Islamic philosophy, which I've studied a fair amount, and then David Hume borrowed it from medieval Islamic philosophy in his discussion of causation. And what I would say is that when fire burns cotton, fire and cotton also oversimplify each other. I will not say they are conscious. I will not say fire and cotton have minds. I don't know. They probably don't. But that's not the point. The point is you don't need a mind to oversimplify something. So when fire burns cotton, fire is only interacting with the flammability of the cotton. It is not interacting with the color, with the smell, with the texture, the taste, if there is a taste of cotton. And so the fire oversimplifies the cotton just as humans do. In fact, we probably oversimplify it less. And then there are insects, there are animals, there are bacteria. All of these living creatures can interact with cotton in ways that we cannot imagine. So those are the two things I would change about Heidegger. First of all, tools are not completely in a system. Second of all, the human world relation is just one kind of relation among many others. We do not always have to talk about the human perspective first as the gateway through which all modern philosophy must pass. Alfred North Whitehead, another 20th century philosopher, made this change as well. He openly said he is willing to return to the pre-Kantian era of philosophy and talk about any relation between any two objects as being on the same footing as the human world relation. So that's the first general step. Now, most readers, and especially critics of object-oriented ontology, never get any further than this. They simply say object-oriented ontology thinks objects withdraw, objects hide. And then they try to say that why that can't be true. Well, yes, we do say objects withdraw and hide, but I have never claimed any originality for this point. This is simply the basic insight of Kant, Heidegger, certain other philosophers. You can find bits of it even in Aristotle, because Aristotle says in the Metaphysics that you cannot define anything because definitions use words. Words are universals, but things are concrete. So even for Aristotle, there's already this gap between language and the world. Or in Plato, there's a difference between this world and the world of perfect forms. And so philosophy even since ancient times, has always recognized something like a withdrawal. And so that's not anything original about object-oriented ontology. That's object-oriented ontology trying to become rooted in the great tradition of philosophy and to try to stop the modern confusion of philosophy as a form of science. Given the success of the natural sciences in the modern period, the last 4 centuries, there has been an understandable tendency to try to turn everything into a science. Analytic philosophy is a great example of this, trying to turn philosophy into a very rigorous scientific discipline with certain methods and procedures that need to be very accurately followed by group teamwork, and then we're all going to make collective progress together step by step, just like physics does. Well, the problem with that is that philosophy in ancient Greek, of course, is philosophia, which means love of wisdom. It doesn't mean wisdom. It means we are trying to attain a wisdom that not only does no one have, but no one can ever have. Socrates says only a god could have knowledge. He says an animal has none. I don't agree with that part, but let's just play along with that. The human is stuck in between. We have some knowledge, we don't have all knowledge. We are stuck in between. And I think this is the predicament that philosophy is always in. And therefore, to think of philosophy as a science is a mistake. But that's the first dualism that object-oriented ontology accepts, the difference between reality itself and reality as present to us. Okay, the second one, which doesn't get talked about as much by critics, is the difference between objects and their qualities. And of course, this is a very classical distinction. You can find this in the distinction between existence and essence in medieval philosophy, which is also an Islamic idea that comes from Ibn Sina or Avicenna, came into Western philosophy along with the rest of Islamic philosophy, most of it through Spain into France. And where this is relevant is in Edmund Husserl's philosophy. I've criticized Husserl already, but I love phenomenology. I was raised on phenomenology. And what I like best about Husserl is the way he is critiquing David Hume's theory that objects are bundles of qualities. So David Hume in the 1700s made the case that there isn't really such a thing as an apple. Because all we really experience when we find an apple are round, red, juicy, cold, hard, solid. And we see these qualities come together so often that we form them into a bundle, and we give that bundle of qualities a nickname, which is apple. But we never actually saw something called apple, according to Hume. We simply saw red, round, cold, hard, juicy, sweet. And in order to put all those things together in our minds, we invented the name apple to create that bundle. I reject this idea of Hume's, and it's extremely influential even today. I would say most people accept it without acknowledging it. And Husserl gave a radical criticism of this idea. This is what phenomenology is all about, because as Husserl points out, I'm holding the apple in my hand, I'm spinning it, I'm throwing it in the air and catching it, I'm taking a bite from it. In each of these moments of time, the apple is showing different qualities. And yet I always know it's the same apple. I'm not saying, oh, I threw it in the air and 2 points of its qualities changed. Therefore, it's a slightly different bundle, and therefore Hume is right. It's not really the same apple. It's changing slightly from second to second. Well, Hume also says that about us as humans, right? He says, just as an object is a bundle of qualities, you as a human being are a bundle of perceptions. And those perceptions are changing constantly. I'm hearing slightly different sounds as cars go past my building in the streets right now. I'm hearing my different words come out of my mouth at different seconds. And so I'm actually a different person, according to Hume, in every second. I'm very similar, but slightly different. And therefore, I'm not quite the same person, according to Hume. Well, I'm on Edmund Husserl's side and phenomenology's side in this one, because Husserl points out that there's always this gap between an object and its qualities. The object is always displaying many different qualities at any moment. And the point of phenomenology is to do what he calls the eidetic reduction, and to use my mind to take away the inessential things and try to gain an intuition of the essence of the thing. So let's say I were trying to discover the essence of myself as a phenomenologist. What is it that makes me who I am? Well, obviously, I need to get rid of the sounds I happen to be hearing right now, because those are accidental. I've never heard these sounds before. I'll never hear them again. And so those are purely accidental for who I am. The fact that I am speaking these words, that I'm speaking to people in Indonesia rather than Japan, that I am speaking on October 11th rather than October 13th, these are purely accidental, according to Husserl. To get at the essence of who I am, I need to strip all of that away and try to find the object that is me beneath all of the qualities. And then Husserl says that the senses can never give you the essential qualities. It's the intellect. Only through the intellect can you find what the true qualities are that make me who I am, or that make any object what it is, whether it be an apple or a dog or a car. And this is where my other objection to Husserl comes, because the intellect really isn't any better at getting at essences of things than the senses are. We all know that the senses, the human senses, are finding things in the world that are temporary, that are passing very quickly, that are accidental. But the same holds true for the intellect, because although Husserl was a rationalist, Husserl saw himself as a scientist, or better, as a kind of mathematician, since his training was in mathematics. Husserl is part of this 4-century-long idea that philosophy should become more scientific. It should become more rigorous. And I'm here on Heidegger's side against his teacher, Husserl, that the idea of a scientific philosophy is a wrong conception, because philosophy has always been philosophia. It has always been about that which escapes knowledge. And so now knowledge is a kind of approximation. And of course, I'm not saying that science doesn't realize this either, because science isn't just about knowledge either. Science is also about drawing our attention to that which escapes knowledge currently. For instance, the two pillars of 20th century physics, quantum theory and general relativity, are incompatible. They both work in their own area. We keep using both of them. And yet there's this central mystery, like a black hole, at the heart of science today for the past 100 and some years. No one can answer this question. Anyway, those are the two differences, the two dualisms from which object-oriented ontology is built. The first is the difference between the withdrawn and the accessible. The second is the difference between objects and qualities. When you put those two together, that's when you get the fourfold structure that's described in my book, The Quadruple Object. Real objects, real qualities; sensual objects, sensual qualities. If you've read the book, you've seen that I try to derive time and space from that, but also what I call essence and eidos. Incidentally, I think that's one of the most original points of object-oriented ontology. Philosophers have always talked about time and space since the beginning. Of course, time and space are very important aspects of existence. But people have always assumed that time and space belong by themselves on that level. Time and space, time and space, time and space. Why just those two? Isn't there anything else that belongs on the same level as those two that belongs in the discussion? And in the quadruple object, I believe I was the first to say essence and eidos, these are other forms of object quality tensions that are on the same level as space and time. So all four of these need a unified theory. And there's still a lot more to be done with that than I have done, I think. And I'm surprised this idea has not caught on more, because I think it's one of the most interesting ideas of object-oriented ontology. So I'll say that much about the quadruple objects. Let me now move on to, I'll just make a couple more points since I only have 25 minutes. Along with this idea of objects as withdrawing and of philosophia as unable to touch reality directly, another common popular set of concepts from object-oriented ontology is the idea of undermining, overmining, and dual-mining. This is a little more popular. This is caught on a little more. The idea here is that there are really only two kinds of knowledge, and both of them fail to exhaust the objects of knowledge. So here's the water in my bottle, and if somebody, let's say someone from another planet, didn't know what water was and they asked me what this is, there's only two real ways I can answer the question. One of them is to say what the water is made of. The other is to say what it does. So I could use the first option. I could say water is chemically H2O. It's made of 2 atoms of hydrogen bound with 1 atom of oxygen. I could even tell the history of how water was created in the universe. I actually personally don't know that history. I'm not sure why there is so much water on Earth, but I could go now online and probably find this out in a few minutes. How did the water on Earth originate? That's one kind of answer I can give. I'm going downward from the water and trying to talk either about the pieces, smaller pieces it's made of, or I'm trying to talk about its history. And this is what I call undermining, because you're going under the water to explain it in terms of something smaller or earlier. What's wrong with this? Nothing's wrong with it. It's just that it misses something. It misses the emergence in the water. The water has a certain reality that cannot be explained, and it may be explained, but it's not exhausted by its history or its pieces. So famously, if water is H2O, there's a problem, which is that the H and the O, hydrogen and oxygen, both make fire more powerful. They are fuel for fire. Water puts out fire. Isn't that strange that you can take two things that increase fire, put them together, and they destroy fire? It's a very strange thing. And actually, it can be explained. We can use quantum chemistry to explain why this happens. So it's not a mystery. The point isn't that it's a mystery. The point is that the parts do not explain the whole by themselves. Something else happens at a level that's higher than the parts. And that is what undermining misses. It misses emergence. So if I try to say Los Angeles, where I'm sitting, is made of however many trillion atoms, yes, but that doesn't really explain anything, because a lot of what goes on in Los Angeles, most of what goes on in Los Angeles, atoms are irrelevant. They don't really explain anything. The city of Los Angeles gains and loses atoms constantly. It gains and loses people every day. People die here every day. New people are born, new people move in, new people move out. So Los Angeles cannot be talked about in terms of its smaller pieces. That can be helpful, but it doesn't really explain it. So that's one kind of knowledge, when you're trying to go down beneath a thing and say what it's ultimately made of. The other kind of knowledge, which, I should say that undermining is the most popular way of doing things among the pre-Socratics. This is what typifies Western philosophy before Socrates, undermining. The pre-Socratics are trying to ask the question, what is everything made of? And they say water, or everything's made of air, or everything's made of air, earth, fire, and water, joined by love and separated by hate, or it's made of numbers, or it's made of this indefinite formless operon, like a blob. So all the pre-Socratics are undermining thinkers. And I see them as scientists more than as philosophers. They're very interesting thinkers, but they're not quite philosophers yet. The Philosophia is not quite there, except in a few spots, maybe in Heraclitus when he talks about mystery. But if we turn now to the modern era is more about overmining, the opposite term, talking about what a thing does or how it affects my mind. And the reason for this, of course, is that modern philosophers want to start with what is given to them. So Descartes starts with, I think, therefore I am. Everything around me may be an illusion, but I know that I'm thinking. Or for Husserl, we must first start with what is given to consciousness, what is given to the mind. We can't invent theories. If I hear a door slam, I shouldn't invent theories about sound waves going through the air and vibrating my eardrum. That's what science does. Husserl wants to start with what he considers a more fundamental point, which is, how does the sound of the door slamming affect my consciousness? What are the exact things that happen in my mind when I hear a door slam? Bruno Latour wants to focus on what a thing does instead of inventing theories about what it is. So overminers, who are mostly modern thinkers, don't want to be tricked by their own theories. They want to start only with what is directly given to us, what we can perceive for ourselves, what is there. Okay, the problem with overmining theories, which are the only other kind of knowledge, is that a thing is not just what it's doing, as I mentioned in the case of Heidegger's tool analysis. A thing is more than it's currently acting. Right? So the hammer is not just a hammer that's hitting a nail. The hammer is also a hammer that has a crack in the handle that we don't realize, which maybe 5 minutes from now, the hammer will break. So overmining also fails, because there are properties in the thing that are beneath awareness, that are beneath its actions. So those two forms of knowledge both fail. And I'm not saying they're useless, because knowledge is maybe the most important thing human beings have. If knowledge were to disappear, 98% of humans would die very horribly, very quickly. We'd go back to Stone Age hunter-gatherers with very little knowledge. And so knowledge is an extremely important thing, but it is not quite philosophia. It is not an awareness of that in reality, which is not directly attainable and has to be attainable by indirect means. Well, what are some of these indirect means? Because we need a way of talking about the world that is indirect, that is not a form of knowledge, that is not a form of undermining or overmining. One obvious example of this, and one that I place very high on my cognitive list, is the arts. The arts give us a form of cognition that is not really a form of knowledge. You may gain some knowledge from an artwork. So for instance, if you look at Picasso's Guernica, famous painting, bombing done by the German Air Force during the Spanish Civil War, you might learn a little bit about the Spanish Civil War. You might find yourself asking, oh, Guernica, I need to research that. I want to learn more about what happened there. But that's not really what the painting is about. It doesn't really matter so much that the painting is about that particular incident in the Spanish Civil War. 500 years from now, probably no one will remember the Spanish Civil War, and yet the painting may still be looked at with admiration by fans of art. Picasso in that painting depicts human suffering from war in a way that is universal. It could be relevant to any war in any century, in any continent. It doesn't have to be Spain. It doesn't have to be the 1930s. And so Picasso isn't really teaching us something about war is like. He's giving us an aesthetic experience. He's giving us a way of feeling as if we're part of that war and feeling the anguish of the people who are affected with the way the faces are distorted, his typical Cubist style. So I wouldn't call Picasso's painting a form of knowledge, and yet it is a form of cognition. It's not worthless. It gives us something we didn't have before. And the same will be true for any artwork. Any artwork is hinting at the reality that is depicted in that artwork. You cannot take the painting and describe it in prose paragraphs without changing things. So yes, an art critic can write a very nice essay about that painting, but it's not going to exhaust the painting. And whatever emotion you feel when you look at the painting also doesn't exhaust the painting, because you can come back to the painting 10, 20 times. The greater the art, the more times you can do this, and you can keep finding new things about it that you didn't feel before. In fact, there's a famous story of Picasso going with his wife to the Louvre in Paris and standing in front of a painting by Fernand Léger, one of his colleagues. And he stood there for about an hour looking at this painting, and his wife asked him what he thought about it, and he made a critical remark. He said, "The problem with Léger's paintings, in my opinion, is I've been standing here looking at it for an hour, and there's nothing more in it than there was at the beginning. I haven't found anything new." And if that's true, I don't know if that's fair to Léger or not. If it's true, that would mean that that particular painting is not quite at the same level as a greater piece of art that you can go to again and again. And the same for literature. You keep finding new things in it that you didn't find before. And I found that with literature, I read my favorite books maybe again every 10 years or so. And so I'm 10 years older every time I read them, and I'm always finding new things based on my life experience, based on the fact that my memories have faded a bit and new things are coming to the forefront. And so when those two things go together, undermining and overmining, you have what I call dual mining, which is reducing the thing in both directions at once. And this also fails. An example of dual mining is scientific materialism. Because on the one hand, scientific materialism says, oh, all these things I see around us are just made of atoms. That's all it really is. So that's undermining. But then it's also overmining, because they say those atoms can be mathematically calculated with equations. So I can talk about the bottom level, which is atoms, and I can talk about the top level, which is the mathematics that understands those atoms, but I can't talk about anything in between, like the Los Angeles Police Department or the cultural life of Los Angeles, things that happen at the middle level, not because of atoms and not because of mathematics, and which require not direct prose discourse, but something more like indirect discourse that you get in the case of things like wine criticism. I mentioned wine criticism. Daniel Dennett, the American analytic philosopher who died last year, is very hard on wine criticism. And I realize in Indonesia, a lot of people don't even drink wine. It's forbidden in Islam. But it's a very nicely developed discourse. So a wine taster can drink a wine and say, a flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina. So it's a very poetic way of describing the flavor of the wine. Dennett makes fun of this. He says that's ridiculous. Real wine tasting is you would put the wine in a machine and the machine would give you a chemical formula. And I would say that's not the real wine. That's not the real wine. You need something poetic like the flamboyant and velvety Pinot lacking in stamina. And if you don't drink wine, you can think about restaurant critics. Restaurant critics describe food this way. Or literary critics describe literary works this way. To be a good critic of literature or film or something like this, you have to be somewhat poetic yourself. You're using metaphors, you're using getting at the thing. And so I think this kind of discourse needs to be much more highly valued by philosophers, as it already is by literary critics. I think we need philosophy critics in the way of literary critics, meaning philosophy critics who aren't just showing which arguments are right and wrong, but philosophy critics who are saying, you know, in Schelling, we find something a bit short-winded, right? That Schelling picks up ideas and doesn't develop them, but something along those lines. Anyway, so I think we need to be careful of undermining, overmining, and dual mining. They're important, but they are not exhaustive. And now I'm going to end with just one idea to tell you what I'm thinking about these days, and then I'll move on to our next distinguished speaker, Fakhri Afif. I wrote an article a few years ago. I don't know if any of you saw it, where I was talking about how philosophy defines knowledge as justified true belief, usually. Justified true belief is the usual way of defining knowledge. And this happens, for instance, in Plato, in the dialogue, the Meno, when they're talking about which way is the road to Larissa in northern Greece. And someone could accidentally get it right. Somebody could say, this way is the road to Larissa. They actually have no idea, but they accidentally get it right. And they tell someone to go that way. The person goes there, they get to Larissa. Good job. The person went to the right place. But the person actually got lucky. They didn't really know the right way to go to Larissa. They were guessing. We would never call that knowledge, of course. And that's what Plato is wondering about. So just being right isn't enough to be knowledge. You also need justification, right? There needs to be some reason why you thought that was Larissa, and the reasons turn out to be right. It can't be a lucky guess. And so philosophy, for a long time, calling knowledge justified true belief. There have been rare attempts to say that it's only justification or that it's only truth. What I said in my article is that it can't be justified true belief because justification and truth are opposites in some way. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Really, if we think about science, what science is about is justification, not truth. Because I mentioned there's always that gap, right, between what any scientific theory is today and what the reality is. So for centuries, Isaac Newton taught us that gravity happens at the speed of light. And it also happens at a distance, right? The objects at a distance can attract each other, even though they're not touching. And that it happens with, sorry, not speed of light, that's Einstein. That it happens at infinite speed for Newton. That there is no time delay in gravity. It happens instantly at a distance. And for 230 years, this was believed. But it wasn't true, we know today. We know, thanks to Einstein, that it can't happen at infinite speed. It can only happen at light speed. Nothing goes faster than light speed, according to contemporary physics. And so gravity is not infinite speed. Newton also thought that mass is conserved, meaning that the same amount of mass, same amount of mass. It never changes. Well, Einstein showed that mass can be converted into energy. So now we have nuclear weapons, we have atomic power. Because of that, matter and energy are convertible. So Newton's theory of physics was not true. It was, however, justified in the sense that the knowledge of the day, that was the best possible theory, no doubt. And it wasn't until later developments, certain things were noticed that allowed Einstein to come up with his superior theory of gravity and of mass. So science is never justified and true at the same time. Science is what I will call fallibilistic. It's always wrong. It's always moving away from past science towards better theories. And there will never be a perfect coincidence between the knowledge and the, between the justification and the truth, because those two things are not the same. Newton had his justifications, his reasons for saying what he said, but they were never enough to get truth. Okay, so what is truth? I'm somewhat skeptical of the word because I prefer the word reality over truth, because I don't think anyone really has the exact truth, philosophically speaking, at least. There's always going to be a mismatch, a gap between what you think is the truth and what is the reality. Okay, but let's talk about truth in a loose sense now, or reality. Let's talk about philosophy that does not use justifications. Think about an author like Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a very, very powerful philosophical writer. Nietzsche can change your life when you read him. He puts you in a certain mood where you begin to speculate philosophically in a very personal way. I don't agree with everything Nietzsche says, but there's a reason he's very popular with young philosophers, because he's empowering, right? He makes young philosophers feel prepared to speak and think for themselves and not just listen to others. This is the power of Nietzsche. He never gives any I wouldn't say never gives any, but he often gives no justifications for what he says. He just says what he thinks. And yet quite often that's enough to change your way of looking at reality. He gives you an idea and you think, wow, that's a powerful idea. Here's a famous one. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. This is becoming very popular throughout culture now in the United States. I don't know about Indonesia, but there's a line in one of his books where he says, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, which means even the worst experience of suffering, you can turn to your own advantage. You can become something good. But he never gives a reason for that. He just says it. And so I could ask him, what are your reasons for that? I actually disagree. I think what doesn't kill you can also damage you so that you're weakened. So there could be an argument back and forth about this. Give a justification. He simply asserts it. And in analytic philosophy, for example, you can't just assert something. You have to give reasons for it. You have to give arguments. I've even heard some analytic philosophers say Wittgenstein isn't really a good philosopher because he doesn't give arguments. He just asserts things in the Tractatus. All right, that's true. But Alain Badiou, the contemporary French philosopher, still alive today in his 80s, has a very interesting distinction between what he calls philosophy and what he calls anti-philosophy. And he thinks they work very closely together. And Nietzsche and Wittgenstein are examples of anti-philosophers. And there are others. Pascal, Kierkegaard's, from Christianity, St. Paul, the apostle of Jesus. These are people who are, we recognize them as something similar to philosophers, but they're not really giving arguments. They're not giving justifications. They're saying, in a sense, that philosophy and all its argumentations is a waste of time because life is short. Like Kierkegaard said against Hegel, you might only live for 70 years. You don't have enough time to know for sure if Hegel's dialectic is right or not. You have to make a choice. Are you going to be a religious person or not? You're never going to have enough arguments for or against religion to make a decision based on arguments, but your life is short, so you're going to have to make a choice. This is Kierkegaard's in Denmark. And that's what Badiou calls anti-philosophy. They always have this idea that ultimately what you believe is partly a matter of decision, not just of argument. And if we put decision in line with truth, so if you say my truth is I believe this, you can offer justifications for it, but those justifications are never going to be enough to convince everyone else. There's always going to be a personal element. So you may be the most devout believer in a certain religion, and you may even succeed in converting some other people you know, but you're never going to convert everyone you meet, even if you try. And so there's always going to be something personal about that religious faith, or in the case of an atheist, that lack of religious faith. They're not going to be able to convince all religious people not to believe in religion either. And so there's that gap always between the personal side and the justified side. So I've been thinking about new approaches to this problem. That's what my recent work has been about. And I don't really have things now that are enough to share in any mature form, but at some point, I'm going to be writing about this, and I'm going to be linking it to the phenomenon of conspiracy theories. I taught a class on conspiracy theories a year ago. And of course, what's interesting about conspiracy theories is that when people believe in conspiracy theories, they're believing in something that the rest of the public doesn't consider to have justification. So it's a kind of anti-philosophy. And some conspiracy theories are more popular than others. Some are a little crazier or less often believed. Some of them turn out to be true later. A lot of them don't, but some of them do. So here's one that's very popular in America. And I believe this one. In America, between 40 and 60% of people believe that the story of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 is not the true story. The true story is that one man named Lee Harvey Oswald, sitting in the building, shot down and killed President Kennedy. He was arrested, and then 2 days later, he was killed by somebody else in the jail, Jack Ruby. Usually between 40 and 60% of American people do not believe that. I've never really believed it. I think there was more of a conspiracy. Somebody wanted Kennedy dead. That's a more popular one. Another popular one. For many years, 40 to 60% of people in America believed that the United States Army was covering up evidence of UFOs. Well, the funny thing is now the Army admits that. I should say the Navy. The United States Navy will share videos of what they might be alien spacecraft flying past our airplanes very fast. And the United States Navy admits they don't know what these are. But that was very secret for a long time. They wouldn't admit this. But now finally you can go and find videos where the Navy says, here's some strange things our pilots saw. We don't know what they are. Then you get really crazy ones like the lizard people theory, which comes out of England, which is the idea that the world is, all the people who rule the world, like all the presidents, all the business leaders, are what they call lizard people. They're part human, part lizard. Only about 2 or 3% of America believes that. It's a very, very minor belief. But what's interesting about that is that the people who believe the conspiracy theory, they may give justifications, but the justifications are very weak. Anyway, conspiracy theories are a way of embracing a truth that does not seem to have a very strong justification in the eyes of the rest of society. And so that gap, what is it that leads a person to believe in something, to embrace it as a truth, with what others regard as minimal or no justification? in that sense, I think the growth of conspiracy theories is not just a negative thing, it's also a positive thing because it's allowing us to consider this problem. How is it that knowledge isn't just about justification and it's not just about truth? It's about a strange mix of both. So I'll leave it there because that's what I'm researching these days. I think I went over 25 minutes and I'm very sorry. I tried not to. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your very brilliant ideas, Professor. And I think now we can proceed to my colleagues, Afif. Um, can I have an assist on to present Afif presentation because Afif is also make some slides to help his presentation. Okay. Okay. Afif, you have at least 20 minutes to give some commentaries to Professor Harman ideas, particularly on the object-oriented ontology. Afif, your script.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Neo, for your welcoming. Firstly, I would like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to meet Professor Graham Harman in person, engage in this outstanding conversation, and ultimately gain a substantial amount of wisdom from him. Before proceeding, I must acknowledge that actually this is my inaugural presentation in English, but nevertheless, I will endeavor to articulate my thoughts with almost clarity and precision. It is imperative for me to articulate from the outside about the profound significance of Graham Harman's philosophical and practical contribution to practical contribution, which are truly remarkable, magnificent, and extraordinary. His discourse is beginning to garner the interest of researcher, enthusiasts, or philosophical discourse in Indonesia. And it is my hope that this discussion forum will serve as an intellectual catalyst, thereby increasing the visibility of these remarkable ideas among the Indonesian public. Okay, Mr. Setiawan, can you please next the slide? Okay, I think this is the moment I will clarify. Hopefully, Professor Harman can clarify my personal understanding about his works. So I will give some commentary, and I think a lot of things that have presented and discussed by him. So I will jump one slide by slide. So maybe for some introductory notes, Professor Harman frames object-oriented ontology as a response that so-called post-truth phenomenon, where appeals to belief and emotion dominate over claims to fact. But instead of falling back on truth or knowledge as the solution, object-oriented ontology emphasizes the reality itself, reality that always exceeds our attempts to capture it. In his book, The Quadruple Object, Graham Harman urges us to restore objects to the center of philosophy. So rather than beginning with the radical doubt, as Descartes did when he asked whether the external world might not exist at all, Professor Harman begins from naivety. We live in the midst of objects. I think we should highlight here that objects should not be understood only as physical things like chairs, books, or mobile phones. Objects also include non-physical realities, nations, institutions, music, or even fictional creators like Unicorn or Iron Man, maybe. All of these count as objects in the ontological sense, as entities that can be thought about and that interact with others. So Harman's central argument is deceptively simple but philosophically radical. Object cannot be reduced. They cannot be reduced downward. For example, by saying that a human being is nothing but a bundle of cells and atoms, nor can they be reduced upward by saying that a human being is nothing but a set of social relations or merely a perception in the minds of the others. So for Harman, objects possess autonomy. They exist in their own right and cannot be swallowed up by smaller elements or dissolved into a larger context. Therefore, the task for philosophy then is to build a kind of metaphysics that neither reduce object downward to a more basic component nor upward to their appearances or relation. Okay, next. Okay, so Harman begins by diagnosing the two ways in which philosophers have traditionally and mistakenly dismissed object. The first is undermining, as we have already listened from him, that reduce objects to more basic component or elements. It is claiming that the object are not fundamental, that they are simply aggregates of the smaller entities. So we can see in the modern science, the view takes the form of reductionism by saying that everything is nothing but atoms. From this perspective, a cat is not really a cat at all, but only a temporary bundle of molecules. The second one is overmining. It denies that objects have any hidden depth by claiming that objects are too mysterious to be real, and that all we truly have are relations, effects, and bundle of qualities. For David Hume, for instance, an apple is a simply bundle of qualities, red, sweet, hard, and juicy. There is no apple at all behind these sensations. In Berkeley's extreme idealism, said that to exist simply to be perceived. So Harman argues that both strategies fail. They miss the reality of objects as wholes. Objects are neither shallow nor superfluous. So in this sense, objects are real in themselves, and any philosophy that ignores their autonomy misses what is most important. For example, a child encountering a cat does not perceive a bundle of atoms, not merely a bundle of qualities like a furry or meowing. The child perceives a cat an object in its own right. So, in the midst of this philosophical battle, Harman's philosophical endeavor is evident in its attempts to defend objects against reductionism from the two sides. Okay, next. So, in his book, published in 2017, Object Oriented Ontology, Harman engaged with the contemporary obsession in the physics with the finding so called theory of everything. Scientists often imagine that one formula, perhaps maybe through string theory, I guess, could account for all that exists. But Harman argues that this ambition is misguided because it rests on the four false assumptions. First, physicalism, the belief that only physical matter is truly real. Second, smallism, the idea that the tiniest entities are somehow more real than the larger wholes. The third one is anti-fictionalism, the claim that fictional are unreal. But as we know, Sherlock Holmes, though never flesh and blood, has shaped literature, culture, even tourism in London. And the fourth one is literalism, the belief that reality can be fully captured in propositional statement. From this critique, Harman argues that if there is a genuine theory of everything, it belongs not to physics, but to metaphysics. And more precisely, as we know, to object-oriented ontology. Okay, next. Next. I will not get into sensual and real object and quadruple object. Next. Okay, next. Indirect causation. Next. Okay, so let me give my personal overview. We can draw some concluding remarks on Harman philosophical project by stating that object-oriented ontology is a new metaphysics for the age of speculative realisms. Objects are neither reducible to their smallest pieces nor exhausted by the relation or appearances. They have what Harman termed quadruple structures that ensure both accessibility and at the same time the withdrawal. The implications are profound actually. Reality is both flat and deep. It is flat because all entities like cats, atoms, nation, myth, artworks, or even religion are objects. There is no privileged class of being really counts, while others are mere appearances. But it is also deep at the same time because each object conceals an inexhaustible surplus that no relation, perception, or description can capture it. In the final chapter of Harman's book, he summarized the guiding, I would say it's kind of like guiding maxims of object-oriented ontology and clarifies what makes object-oriented ontology distinctive among philosophical approach. The first principle is a flat ontology. All objects equally exist. There is no hierarchy of being where humans sit on the top, followed by animals, and then plants, and then inanimate matter. A human being, a tree, a hammer, a galaxy, even a fictional character like Spider-Man, all exist as an object. Not in the same way, actually, but if, in ontological dignity. I think this maxim challenged both human-centered philosophy, or what Hallman called subject-oriented ontology. We can see in the correlationist continental philosophy since Descartes, and reductionist science or scientism. The second principle is anti-reductionism. Hallman criticized two common mistakes in philosophy: undermining and overmining. The third one is withdrawal. Every object has a has a depth that eludes us. We never encounter the object in its fullness, only its appearances, its effects, or its relations. Take example of the tree to a bird, it is nesting place; to a lumberjack, it is a timber; to a painter, it is play of light and form. Yet none of this encounter exhausts the tree reality. Something always withdraws. And the fourth one is ascetic is central to philosophy. Since object withdrawal, literal knowledge, like in scientific proposition, cannot capture them. But metaphor, art, and aesthetic allow us to approach the hidden depth from these objects. Think of how painting captured the essence of a city more than statistics do, or how the poem gestures toward the feeling of love better than a psychological survey. For Harman, philosophy must learn from art. It must embrace indirect, metaphorical modes of access. The last one is indirect relation. Objects do not interact directly, but only through mediations. When two people speak, they do not encounter each other's essence directly, but only through language, gestures, and interpretation. So these principles explain why causality is never totally and total, and why objects always maintain their autonomy. Object-oriented ontology challenges us to rethink reality itself. It tells that humans are not the measure of all things, as we know in Anthropocene era, that knowledge does not exhaust reality, and that objects withdraw from every attempt to capture them. Object-oriented ontology then is a philosophy that refuses reduction, affirms the autonomy of all objects, and insists on their withdrawal, and finds in aesthetic to key engaging with them. It is not a technical school, actually, of thought, but a way of reimagining our place in the world. Okay, next. So I think I would like to share my personal reflection because my background is I'm engaged in my master thesis about hermeneutical discourse. So I would like to make some conversation about how object-oriented ontology have and can be contribute to a hermeneutical theory. Okay, next. So we can see that contemporary hermeneutics, especially in the wake of Gadamer and Ricoeur, is structured around the human-world relations, the dialectic of understanding, distanciation, and appropriation of meaning. If we read Harman's work carefully, object-oriented ontology proposes a more radical ground. It begins not with a correlation, the unescapable relation between subject and object, but with autonomy of objects themselves. Every object, whether textual, technological, natural, or fictional, withdraws from direct access. If hermeneutics is the theory of interpretation, then object-oriented ontology invites us to reconceive interpretation not as a discourse of the text's full meaning, but as a mediated and partial encounter with withdrawn objects. So we can see in Recurrent tradition, for example, interpretation is never exhausted by a single reading. Text project worlds and open and exhaustible possibilities. Harman's principle of withdrawal provides an ontological grounding for this insight. The inexhaustibility of interpretation is not only a linguistic or cultural phenomenon, it reflects then a deeper structure of the object themselves. Objects are never given in the full, but only through sensual profiles, just as texts are never reducible to intention or to context. This means interpreting objects without reducing them to human projection or to mere relations and hermeneutical plurality. This becomes the epistemic correlate of ontological withdrawal. Object-oriented ontology, as we know, claims that objects interact only indirectly through mediation, or what Harman calls vicarious causation. This resonates, I think, with Rico's insistence that we encounter the world only through the mediation of text and symbols. In object-oriented hermeneutics, as I will call it, interpretation is not a direct grasp of meaning, but a recognition of how objects make a contact through intermediaries, metaphors, narratives, interfaces, or institutional frameworks. Hermeneutics thus becomes the mapping of mediation through which reality is disclosed, always obliquely, never transparently. Interpretive encounter are always mediated, whether the mediator is text, technological interface, an artwork, or the sensual facade of social institution. Ricoeur emphasized distanciation, that the text gains autonomy from the author, reader, and the context, making possible critical interpretation. Moreover, meaning often comes to us via mediated historical symbolic forms like language, myth, ideology, archives. So interpretation then as a detour from immediate consciousness into a symbolic world. If we think about it in object-oriented ontology, we can say that it generalizes this principle. All objects are distant from each other, never reducible to the relations or appearances. So the hermeneutical detour thus finds an ontological anchor. The object itself guarantees the necessity of interpretation, since its essence cannot be collapsed into the presence. Interpretation become possible and necessary because objects always exceed the horizon in which they appear. So I think this is the last from my personal reflection, that hermeneutics for Ricoeur is not a merely understanding, but also critique, unmasking ideology and distortion. Object-oriented ontology, I think, strengthens this critical moment by insisting on a flat ontology. All entities exist on the same ontological plane, whether human or non-human, natural or fictional. Such flattening resists both scientific reduction, undermining object to a subatomic particle, and a social constructivist reduction, overmining them to discourse or power. So within hermeneutics, this implies a broadened field of interpretation. We must interpret not only text, but infrastructures, algorithms, and ecosystem. Critique is extended beyond ideology to include the way non-human actors structure the meaning. So object-oriented ontology supplies a metaphysical humility with the principle of object withdrawal. Ricoeurian hermeneutical theory supplies a methodological humility that text objects distance themselves. If we can combine and put them together, they yield an interpretive stance that is both ontologically generous and critically aware. So in this scheme, we can think a hermeneutical stance that first refuse to make an object a mere text to human intention, And the second one is recognize the textualize, historical, and social mediation without collapsing the object into those mediations. Next. So by combining this principle, I think we can arrive at the outline of what I call object-oriented hermeneutics. The first one is withdrawal, grounds the inexhaustibility of meaning. The second one is mediation or vicarious causation, explain why interpretation proceeds through symbols, metaphors, and institutions. The third one is distantiation, is universalized in the ontological autonomy of objects, not merely the autonomy of the text. And the last is the flat ontology, expands hermeneutics to include the interpretation of all entities, not only linguistic one. So there is, I think, some theoretical consequences for what I propose. The first one is from meaning as a mere human intention to a meaning as a objectual profile. Interpretation no longer primarily seeks the authorial intentionality or socio-discursive decoding, but aims to triangulate the sensual manifestation that point towards the withdrawn reality. I think this broadens hermeneutic targets to include technical artifact and non-human agencies. The second one is hybrid epistemology, because object-oriented hermeneutics legitimize multiple epistemic modes, empirical and scientific, phenomenological and close reading, ascetic speculation. And I think each has domain-specific norms, and together make up a pluralist hermeneutic rationality. And the last one is ethical restraint. By insisting on the withdrawal, object-oriented hermeneutics make ethical demands. Interpreters must instrumentalize object, especially vulnerable beings and non-human entities, through reductive readings. So hermeneutic practice become an ethical stance toward object. So interpretation on this model is not a disclosure of hidden meaning in human-word relation, but the partial mediated encounter between autonomous objects in which humans are only one kind of interpreter among many, including non-humans. Next. Okay, next. Okay, to conclude my presentation, I would like to recall a heated debate currently taking place in one of Indonesian philosophical study circles. Before this forum was held, I wrote, I think, some introductory note on object-oriented philosophy. Shortly thereafter, Rodin Alfair, my colleague at the Odyssey Center for Philosophy and lecturer at Faculty of Philosophy Gadjah Mada in University, wrote a brief essay introducing Meinong's theory of object. Then our mutual colleague, Risalatul Hukmi, the founder of where we publish our writings in Antinomy Institute, and a philosophy lecture at the same alma mater as Rodinal, then critically responded and proposed some objection to these two articles. The following is my personal summary of his article entitled Ontology that is wasteful and acrobatic, and hopefully Professor Harman can respond and give some clarification critically with this article. Next. So the central arguments for Hukmi critique that he is try to lay out the metaphilosophical argument against object-oriented ontology, and by extension against the broader project of flat ontology. It claims that rather than democratizing being, object-oriented ontology, he said, collapse under its own ontological weight. Its radical inclusivity of all entities, real, fictional, imaginary, produce not a metaphysical liberation, but conceptual inflation and theoretical redundancy. So the critic situates object-oriented ontology as a contemporary repetition of Alexis Meinong's theory of objects. Object-oriented ontology, by granting, I think, equal ontological status to every object, planet, algorithm, or fictional character, reanimate this same ontological generosity. Like Meinong, object-oriented ontology framework equates thinkability or describability with ontological standing, thereby inflating the category of being without corresponding explanatory gain. So the critics say flat ontology is Menongian revival that mistake the semantic possibility of reference for ontological necessity. The second critic recalls Russell's theory of description and Quinn's criterion of ontological commitment to argue that the meaningful discourse about an entity does not entail its existence. Philosophically, this reinstated the principle of ontological parsimony. We should not posit entities beyond what is necessary to make our theories work. So the critic tried to apply it to object-oriented ontology and say that the claim that every entity withdraws and possesses autonomous existence adds no explanatory precision to our understanding of causation or interpretation. Instead, it burdens ontology with superfluous commitment, or what Quinn would call ontological extravagance. So we can ask, said the critic, what explanatory necessity justifies the postulation of withdrawn real object rather than treating a withdrawal as a heuristic or metaphor? The third one is the misidentification of Kantian problem. So object-oriented ontology, the critic says, respond to Kant correlationism, the idea that we only ever know the world in relation to human cognition. So object-oriented ontology, said the critic, claim to try to overcome this by reasserting the autonomy of objects. However, the critic argues that the category is mistake. The Kantian problem is epistemic, about the limit of knowing, not ontological one, about what exists. So by introducing another layer of withdrawn reality to escape correlationism, the critic said that object-oriented ontology multiplies metaphysical indices rather than refining epistemic tools for solving the problem. Hence, object-oriented ontology solves the conceptual problem by ontologizing it, replacing analytic clarification with speculative multiplication. So, in his thesis, Hookme said that object-oriented ontology mistakes an epistemological limitation for an ontological deficiency, thereby answering the wrong question with the wrong kind of theory. I think this is the last one before I close my my personal commentary. The burden of ontological accountability. The critic introduced a notion of metaphysical responsibility. Every ontological claim must justify why it is needed and what explanatory work it performs. To posit a new entity is to incur a debt of justification. So, object-oriented ontology, the critic claims, fails this test. Its withdrawn object have no clear epistemic or causal role. It claims to flatness, offer rhetorical allure, but lacks theoretical efficiency. By this standard, says the critic, object-oriented ontology becomes ontologically expensive and epistemically inert. The principle of ontology economy, if we refer to Occam's razor, should remind us that philosophy elegance lies in explanatory sufficiency, not a metaphysical abundance. So I think we might like to hear some elaboration and exposition from Harman. How does the claim that all entities withdraw improve our explanatory capacity relative to linear theories of relation and mediation? I think the final claim of this article is so outstanding because it say is object-oriented ontology metaphysical theory that explain or an imaginative fiction that enhance. If it's the latter, what prevent it from collapsing into very magical thinking philosophy once sought to overcome, said the critic. Okay, I think this my personal understanding and personal reading of Harman works and my personal capture about what's going on in Indonesian philosophical circle about your theory and about your proposal. And hopefully we can hear some elaboration from Harman. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Afif, for your service. Professor Harman, I think before we proceed to accept some questions from some of our audiences, maybe, yeah, I think it's very, very intriguing questions about some misunderstanding or some questions, some critic to your idea about triple O, especially the ontological excesses in which we actually already found it. I think it's a plural critics. I think it's a plural critics that we frequently found about your theory. Maybe we can hear from yourself, Professor Harman, some answers about the critic, especially the critic that was presented by Afif, that was previously wrote by one of also our Indonesian, Mr. Hukmi. Professor Harman, the screen is yours.
All right. Yeah, there are a few things I would say in response. I won't have enough time to give a systematic response to each of the points, but first of all, the point speculation without inferential rigor, I'm not sure what to say about that because I do give arguments throughout my books. I'm not just saying things. And the simplest way to look at the argument of triple O, object-oriented ontology, is that I've tried to take Heidegger's tool analysis, which incidentally, Heidegger has become a major figure even within analytic philosophy, thanks largely to the work of Hubert Dreyfus. And so analytic philosophers are quite familiar with what Heidegger is saying about the use of equipment. I think analytic philosophy tends to reduce this to the distinction between the theoretical and the practical. In other words, they tend to reduce Heidegger's analysis to the idea that theoretical cognition is not primary, and that before we're theoretically cognizing anything, we have this prior background of practical use. That actually doesn't go far enough. I think Dreyfus is superficial here. It goes deeper. Heidegger goes deeper and makes the point that there is a reality before there is any use or theoretical justification of a thing. So the reality of the hammer is deeper than my practical use or my theoretical understanding of the hammer. And I'm simply taking Heidegger's tool analysis and making further, I think, more refined arguments based on that to reach some of my more metaphysical conclusions. And so someone shouldn't just say triple O involves speculation without inferential rigor. They try to point to specific places where they think an argument is not made that it should be made, because I have tried to make those arguments throughout my books. Now, it's true that stylistically and rhetorically, my books are very different from those of mainstream academic philosophy. But I've tried to give justifications for that. I've tried to give justifications for why I think metaphorical language, why rhetoric, these have their places in cognition and in philosophia, that we should not be following the model of short journal articles in the natural sciences that analytic philosophers think is appropriate for all intellectual activity. I'm much closer to the world of the arts. And actually, I think this is one of the reasons I have a huge readership in the arts and architecture, whereas frankly, most analytic philosophers do not, because they have, I think, a fairly narrow stylistic conception of what philosophy should look like. So I'll just say that on that point. There's two other things I wanted to respond to. One of them was Meinong, that we're just recycling Meinong. Well, first of all, triple O is not really in danger of ontological inflation, because all of this inflation occurs in what we call the sensual realm. So yes, anybody can think about any object they want, and that's harmless because these are thoughts, right? They belong in the sensual. I can imagine a sensual seven-headed dog that tap dances, and that doesn't really run any risk of ontological inflation, because people can and do think of such things. And we have to recognize that, and we have to make room in our philosophy for that. That doesn't mean that such entities belong in the real. And so I think there is plenty of parsimony. There's room for parsimony in triple O, because not everything in the sensual has any foothold in the real. And so I don't think it's a problem we face. Another point about Meinong is that, as Tristan Garcia has pointed out, Meinong is interested in objects as objects of thought. And so Meinong is still very much in the modern tradition of philosophers who think that the relation to objects is a relation of thought to objects, whereas object-oriented ontology is also interested in relations. In fact, primarily interested in object-object relations, and this is something we don't get any of in Meinong. And so we can't simply be identified with Meinong. And then I've already explained why the inflation doesn't really matter, because you can inflate as much as you want in the sensual realm without any serious consequences. Now, justifying the question about how to justify withdrawal, I think, is the most interesting one. And here's how I would justify it. I think everyone recognizes, except for extreme forms of idealism, everyone would recognize that my thought of a thing is not the same as that thing itself, or my model of a thing is not the same as that thing itself. So the example I've often used is, imagine you could create a perfect intellectual model of a dog. You knew everything possible that there is to know about the dog, mathematically, conceptually. I think everyone would still agree that your model of the dog is not the same thing as the dog. There is still a minimal gap between the two. Now, the question I would ask anyone who thinks withdrawal is unjustified is, how do you account for that gap between perfect knowledge of a dog and the dog itself? And what you'll find if you start talking to people and pressing them on this is that ultimately they will say, well, the real dog inheres in matter, or somehow is made of matter, exists in physical matter, whereas the knowledge of it does not exist in matter, or at least not in the same matter. And so matter is being used as the principle of gap or difference between knowledge and what it's knowledge about. And my response to this is, there is real no justification for the existence of physical matter. No one has ever seen physical matter. Physical matter, in fact, exists as a concept only in order to explain this gap that everyone admits between knowledge and its object. So Aristotle, for instance, when you know a thing, you're bringing the form of the thing into your mind and leaving the matter behind. Okay. Whereas I would say there can't just be a difference in material, that the real dog is in matter and the knowledge of the dog is not in matter, because I don't believe in any such thing as matter. I don't think it's justified. I think what's going on is that there's a difference in form between the knowledge of the dog and the dog itself. The form is never going to be quite the same. And what makes the dog different from my knowledge of the dog is the fact that the forms are different. And why do they have different forms? Well, because they're made of different things, right? The dog, the real dog, is actually made of different parts from the knowledge of the dog, and therefore has a different reality. You know, Kant, in his refutation of the ontological proof for the existence of God, says there's no difference between 100 coins and 100 imaginary coins, except a difference of position. Well, actually, there's a huge difference between the two. It may be that when I visually simulate the imaginary coins in my head, that they look somewhat similar to the 100 real coins when I see them with my eyes, but the forms are actually very different. They're actually different things. And this is the nature of the gap between them. It's not position and it's not matter. So maybe I should stop there. I really appreciate that Fakhri Afif put up these criticisms, because these are the kinds of criticisms people make generally of OOO. And if there's an article someone wrote that summarizes these, please do forward it to me and I can respond at some point in some format. But I think at that point I will stop and just let people ask questions rather than taking more of your time. I know it's late over there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Herman, for your response. I think before we accept some questions from the audience, there is some questions, especially from my friend, Professor, especially from those who just get into philosophy. As you know, Stephen Mumford wrote a book about an introduction to metaphysics, and one of the topic he discussed in his book is about the substratum, the substratum problem, in which he also criticized that concept. And some people who read that book and also read your concept, especially from the quadruple object, is asking about, does your concept of undermining is also serve the same philosophical function as the substratum's role as a property bearer, Professor Harman?
Except remember, I'm criticizing the idea of a substratum. I think you can keep going down below any level, but you're never going to get to an ultimate substratum. And it's been a long time since I looked at Mumford's book, so I can't comment in detail on that. I'd have to refresh my memory. I first became aware of Mumford through his work with George Molnar's book on powers, which I also like very much. So I can't give a detailed comparison to what Mumford says there, but I would say in terms of a substratum, yes, I have a layered conception of the world where you can go down one layer, down another layer, down another layer, but you're not going to get to a final one. In fact, I'm somewhat committed to an infinite regress. I don't think there can be a final level that's a substratum. And maybe this isn't the place to get into why, but I think there can be an infinite regress I don't think there's an infinite progress. I don't think you get to a level where there's a whole or a world. I think we do get to a highest level that's always a temporary level, that certain objects are connected to certain others and the connections go no further. So I don't believe in something called a universe. I think that's just a thought. There's no real universe. But I'm not sure I can give you a better example, a better answer on the substratum question right now. I'd have to pull out my copy of Mumford, which is in a box somewhere, and respond to what he says there.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Herman.
Sure.
We're
Yes.
waiting for the response, Professor Herman.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay. Maybe there is some from our audiences who also want to open their microphone and asking their questions. Okay. Muhammad Ilham, you can directly open your microphone and speak directly to the speakers. The microphone is yours.
And is it really midnight there?
Yeah, it's already it's already Sunday here, Professor.
Before I want to ask, is my sound clear enough? Hello?
It's kind of too loud. Maybe you can put, yeah, it's kind of too loud. So it's
Remove it. I will
okay.
But I will realize. Sorry. Wait some minutes. How now?
Okay, it's better now. Okay, Ilham, you can speak
All right.
directly.
Sorry, I want to switch the speaker first. Okay. Hello?
Okay, this is better. This is better.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really grateful to be part of this session. I find that this discussion on an object-oriented ontology is very interesting, yeah. Especially how Mr. Fahri elaborate the ontology-oriented ontology. I'm so sorry. In the spectrum of hermeneutics, but the one thing that I really make me really interesting and make me wonder that from what I understand that Mr. Professor Harman argued that every object is withdrawn, yeah, that we can never fully know the real object itself, yeah, like what Mr. Brahma Harman mentioned before. If we say about duck, yeah, about duck, when we hear about dog and when we say that I know a dog, I only know how it looks. Yeah, it looks, sounds, and behaves. Yeah, but not the dog it as it really is. Yeah, but the dog as itself. But this really makes me wonder, Mr. Professor, that if we can ever access the real object, how can we be sure that it truly exists in that hidden from it? It doesn't claiming that objects are unknowable already mean we know something about them, yeah, and namely that we are unknowable. Yeah. So is object of so my fundamental question here is object-oriented ontology are object of are I'm so sorry. There's so many distraction here. Are object-oriented ontology not count in a kind of paradox, yeah, knowing that something cannot be known? Yeah, I think that's all my question, and so I'm so sorry. There's my noise here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ilham, for your question. Professor Herman, maybe you can respond to this question.
Now I'm unmuted. Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
Right. Object-oriented ontology is not a form of total skepticism. Obviously, we know certain things, even though we can never prove the existence of them. So we can never prove that gravity exists, I suppose, and yet we make use of Einstein's theory nonetheless. The bigger issue for me is that there's a gap between our knowledge of gravity and gravity itself. And this, I'm a fallibilist, not a skeptic, but I'm a pretty radical fallibilist. And for me, what the withdrawal means is that the gap between the object and our knowledge of the object has to be understood as something more than just a gap of material versus non-material. It has to be a change in the form. And so the question for me becomes, how is the form translated from one place to the other? Anytime there's knowledge, you're translating the form and the thing into our own sort of form. There can never be a perfect gap between that. It's a problem of translation, just like there can never be a perfect translation of Shakespeare. There can never be a perfect translation of nature or of reality or of a dog. So this is what withdrawal means to me. And it's not, withdrawal is not the kind of thing about which you can know nothing. You can still do things with it. We can't see the inside of a black hole, and yet we can still do things with the black hole in our physics. In mathematics, imaginary numbers are, strictly speaking, impossible, right? What is the square root of -1? And yet you need to posit imaginary numbers, and there are many different fascinating things you can do with imaginary numbers in mathematics and increasingly in physics, thanks to Roger Penrose. So I think the withdrawn object in OOO serves as a reminder to people who are rationalists that they cannot gain direct access to reality as it is in itself. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I'm inclined to say right now, based on what I understood of the question.
Okay, thank you, Professor Harman. Is there anyone else from our audience who also want to open the microphone and ask some question, or maybe to give some commentaries? If not, maybe I can return to Afif. Afif, are you still there, Afif?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. As we discussed before, as we discussed previously, that object-oriented ontology is a very promising project. It's a very promising ideas that not only, I think, works in the philosophical realm, but somehow it found its practicability, especially in our Indonesian context. Maybe you can give some brief explanation to our audiences about how object-oriented ontology could also play a role not only in the philosophical realm, not only as a philosophical discourse, but also as a refreshing ideas on some, concrete context of our nowadays society. Previously, Professor Harman already talked about hoax, already talked about fakes, already talked about conspiracy. And what do you think, Afif? Is there anything else beside news and also hermeneutics also could be helped by the ideas of object-oriented ontology? Afif.
I think one of the most crucial part, if we try to try to connect the object-oriented ontology in our Indonesian context, that can be summarized by relating it to Indonesian societies as I would say that it's kind of like a religious societies. So the conversation in public sphere always engage in somehow about the faith, about religious discourse, about the scripture, and a lot of things must to do with this kind of religious discourse. I think even in the secular sphere, like a law, like a social institution, and etc. So maybe if we try to connect object-oriented ontology in our context, I think it can be like it gives us a refresh to think how we can engage in somehow indirect engagement with those in what object-oriented ontology call sensual profiles. So because we know there are a lot of things happen in the past about radicalism and etc. And I think It's like an ethical humility, and what I've tried to propose in object-oriented hermeneutics, how we engage to the scripture and how do we discuss it in public sphere. That is the first thing. So the second one is about moral reasoning in the public sphere. I think we can also imagine how do we can discuss about the moral facts, about the moral philosophical discourse, about how to regulate our society, because Indonesian society is not just about um, um, imagining how to interact each other, but there's a lot of diversity that should be embraced in it. And I think modern philosophy that try to capture and try to implement in the Indonesian society, I think some kind it fails. So maybe object-oriented ontology will give some promise to reimagine the Indonesian society, whether at the religious level and the academic level, or even in the ethical level. Maybe that's my response, Neil.
Okay, thank you so much for your response. Is there anyone else from our audience also want to? Okay, Muhammad Ilham, another response. Ilham, are you still there?
Is my sound
Okay,
enough here?
okay, clear enough.
Okay,
Go on.
Before that, I really want to thank to Professor Harman for the response from my questions. But listening how Mr. Fahri mentioned about how we can engage the object-oriented ontology in the reality in the Indonesia culture, like especially in religious context, yeah. But one thing that makes me really curious is Mr. Fahri do you think from how we engage or how we connect the object-oriented ontology in the problem of in our country Indonesia, especially within hermeneutical framework, yeah. Do you think that what you mentioned before, do you think object-oriented ontology could provide an alternative way to address some problem like such hermeneutic injustice, where certain experience or points are excludes from collective understanding? Yeah, I think it is the most important problem we face here in Indonesia. That's really so many hermeneutical injustice within the process to develop or to if one of the society here want to make or to create a new religion, that's really the how we provide the hermeneutical framework is really provide to hermeneutical injustice. I think that's all, Mr. Fahri, my question here. Thank you.
Okay. The next question is the previous question is for Fahri. Fahri, do you still there?
Okay.
Okay, you can respond directly. Fahri, go on.
I think I will say I will respond it positively that object-oriented ontology, if we can reimagine it and combining it with the hermeneutical discourse, especially that because I'm trained in hermeneutical theory in Paul Ricoeurian tradition. So I would say boldly that yes, it will help us to escape and to and allow us to imagine the epistemic justice in our society, because not only object-oriented ontology um, grounding some, let's say, ontological perspective of how object withdrawn. So how do we interact with not just scripture but religious topics like God, like prophet, and etc. But when it said that the object withdraw, so every single thing of our knowledge is necessarily cannot be captured the entire reality of that objects. The first one. So I think at the ethical level, it as I presented before, it open and broadening our horizon. It's kind of like ethical sensitivity to us to understand that our knowledge is or our interpretive activities cannot be accessed the entire story of the object. I think that's my personal response.
Okay, thank you so much, Fahri, for your response. Is there any response again from Ilham? Ilham, do you want to say something? Ilham, are you still there? Okay, I think we are losing Ilham. Maybe I want to return to Professor Harman before we are going to close this discussion in a very short moment. Professor Harman, as I said earlier in the opening remarks, your ideas is also somehow play a role in the ethical realm, especially your ideas is also influencing some philosophers to develop the commitment on environment, especially those who involved in the deep ecological discourse. But also there are some critics who say that your ontology is make no difference between killing a babies and breaking a rock. Is there any response to this critic, Professor Harman?
Yeah, that's a nonsensical critique because the flat ontology is ontological. It's not ethical. It just says that a baby and a rock are both objects for OOO. That's just a starting point. It doesn't mean there's no difference ethically or politically between how we treat those. So no, that's not what it's about. I would say that there are ethical implications of object-oriented ontology, right? That breaking the stranglehold of human beings on ontology also suggests looking more broadly at how non-human entities play in these other spheres, such as ethics, but also politics. And I've written about political theory a bit and about how modern political theory, which is, and the modern political landscape, which basically is organized along the left and the right. You know, usually you're trying to get a sense of how far to the left or to the right somebody is, or how close to the center. The left and the right in modern political theory are both based on a model of human nature. So for the left, generally speaking, including here Marx and Rousseau and figures of this sort, humans are naturally good, and if things are going badly, it's because either society has corrupted us or there's some evil social class that's exploiting another social class. And the model here is that we need a revolutionary break that rearranges things and gets them as closer to the nature of things, which is humans as equal. Whereas on the right, you find a different theory of human nature. The theory of human nature as being evil, dangerous, something to be held in check, often by force and violence, that people aren't really improvable over time, that people have the same vices and same bad qualities that we've always had, and therefore a certain amount of force is necessary. Okay. The problem with both of these theories is that they both assume that human nature is the center of political theory, when in fact, objects play a huge role in our politics and in stabilizing things. You can see this, that anytime there's a change in the sort of objects that exist, the political sphere changes. So in the case of the United States, our politics have been severely damaged by social media. And this happens through a well-known way. The way it happens is social media companies know that you are more likely to stay engaged if they can make you very angry or very pleased with yourself. And so I, as a person on Facebook, and they can tell from my likes and what I like and dislike, they can tell that I hate Donald Trump and that I generally support the Democratic Party. That's well known, which means that I'm never going to see anything on my Facebook wall that is even remotely pro-Donald Trump. All of the news that I get is going to be about some horrible thing that Trump did, or since it pegs me as a little left of center, it's going to give me stories about some terrible thing some corporation did to exploit the workers. It's going to tell me what I want to hear, basically. Likewise, it's going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Now I am shut out of my Facebook account for technical reasons. I am on a Facebook account where one of my email addresses was hijacked by someone else. I'm able to get to that. It's this woman named Robin Russell. I have no idea who she is, but she's obviously a Republican. And so when I'm on Facebook now, I'm of the news that they think Robin Russell wants to see. So it's all these terrible things about immigrants committing crimes. These are the things that Republicans want to hear about. This is their view of the world. And what this means is that the two sides in America don't really, not only don't we talk to each other, not only do we hate each other now in the last 9 years, we don't even get the same information. We're not facing the same world of facts. We're hearing the kinds of propaganda that social media companies think will make us stay on Facebook longer and want to spend more time there. So this is just an example of one kind of politics that, one kind of object that affects politics. Another one comes from geopolitics, and this has to do with the simple fact of, Anglo-American geopolitics. Unlike continental Europe, England, and then later the United States in a slightly different way, are essentially island powers who don't face any real threats from land neighbors. And this leads to a different kind of foreign policy than you get from a place like France or Germany or Russia, which is always surrounded by possibly powerful neighboring enemies. Some of these things, for instance, and I say the United States, even though we're not an island, just because Canada and Mexico have never been real military threats to the United States. They've not been nearly as powerful. And therefore, the United States does not need to guard the borders militarily with Canada and Mexico. Now, with current Mexico crisis and Trump's immigration policies, that's a different question. But the United States has almost never in its history feared land invasion from Canada or Mexico, except early in the 19th century. But the point being, because of the object, which is the sea, and the fact of being an island, a country will become a naval power, and acting like a naval power tends to make a country a little more aggressive and imperialistic in spirit. It tends to make a country a little more liberal domestically in terms of sharing information than you would find in continental Europe. There are more restrictions on how judges can act in places like the UK and the US than, say, in France, where the judges have a lot of power to investigate crimes as well as judge crimes. And so that's a classic example, geography, of how an object influences politics. That there are certain countries that are natural enemies or natural allies because of geography. And every time there's a big technological change, you get a kind of political crisis as all the politics realigns itself around the new object. So I think when people complain about OOO not having a politics or not having an ethics, what they're really saying is that we're not accepting the sort of expected traditional forms of leftism that you get from modern philosophy. Namely, that humans are alienated in the world, humans are oppressed by certain social classes, and therefore a revolution is needed to throw off that oppression. For me, oppression is not a primary political category, and that's what people on the left don't like. I think humans are entangled with objects. We are not primarily oppressed by other people. There are real cases of oppression that need to be remedied. But looking at oppression as a basic philosophical category means that you assume that humans are naturally autonomous subjects that should not be entangled with things against their will, and that this is the primary task of philosophy, political philosophy, is to disentangle ourselves from the world and to disentangle ourselves from oppression. No, I think we humans are naturally entangled with objects, and it's about finding better forms of entanglements, not about freeing ourselves in revolutionary fashion from oppressive entanglements. That's just a small part of politics to me. So I think a lot of this criticism on the ethical and political front of OOO is coming from a traditional modernist leftist outlook. And for me, that's better than a traditional right-wing outlook, but it's still not good enough. We need something new. We need a new politics. That's not going to do it anymore. That comes from the age of factories, no, I think Marx is a powerful writer in many ways, but I don't think he can afford to be our primary point of political orientation anymore. He's simply too in deep with Hegelian idealism, which I think is philosophically wrong, and for that reason his assumptions are wrong. So I hope that helps enlighten the discussion somewhat.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Harman, for your
Sure.
But again, because this is already midnight here in Indonesia, It's a very enjoyable discussion. It's a very great discussion for us to have with you. But I think we have to close this discussion. But your last remarks, it's really it's really refreshing. It's really new, and somehow you remind me of also a philosopher in Russia, Alexander Dugin. Maybe you're familiar with him.
He's far more to the right than we're on the opposite sides on Ukraine, but yeah, I know Dugin. And actually, Dugin. Let me say something about Dugin, since I'm appalled by his position on Ukraine, but he's actually pretty interesting when he talks about philosophers. When Dugin talks about Hegel or Heidegger, he's actually got some originality, and I find him refreshing in those moments. When he talks about politics, it seems like he just takes traditional Anglo-American geopolitics and flips it upside down. So traditional Anglo-American geopolitics is about the sea, right? And about naval power, and how you've got people like Admiral Mahan in American geopolitics, or you've got Mackinder in British geopolitics. And the idea is that you're not supposed to let any land power dominate Europe. This is the only real danger for the Anglo-American world, is if you get someone like Stalin or Hitler who's dominating Europe. And then Dugin just kind of flips that upside down. Land is good, the sea is evil. And of course, Indonesia, you're an island nation like us. So maybe you see the world a little more like we do. But and you're also a rising power. And you're also very, as you mentioned, very heterogeneous like America, many different people, even more so than us, maybe. You're made up of many different civilizations, religions. So I think Indonesia has a very interesting future and a very interesting role to play, especially as Asia becomes the center of world politics, as seems to be happening. It's not going to be Europe anymore. I think it's going to be Asia, and the rise of China and how that influences everything around. So, but yeah, I think Dugin, he at least is touching on some important issues. Our politics are completely different. I'm no fan of Vladimir Putin, whereas Dugin is. But yeah, maybe at some point, more of a dialogue will open up there.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Harman. Maybe Afif, you have something to close our discussion before I give a closing remarks to summarize our discussion. Maybe 2 minutes, Afif.
Yeah, I think some concluding remarks, about this discussion from me is, I would like to say that this discussion is invitation to the entire audience to actively engage with object-oriented ontology, because this is not only because it reconnects us with objects and undermines the claim that humans are the center of the reality or the universe. Certainly, the ideas outlined by Harman in object-oriented ontology offer much room for development and ever perhaps criticism. So therefore, I have this discussion serve as an open invitation for all of us to recall the classic wisdom of Socrates, who emphasizes that we can only strive to love wisdom, not possess it. That is my closing statement.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all for a truly fascinating discussion. We have journeyed from the withdrawn core of objects to the complex archipelago of real-world implications, and it's been a remarkable ride. Professor Harman, having you here to guide and respond to this has been, for me, it's an immense privilege. It strikes me that our conversation tonight has performed, for me, a perfect triple act of illusion. It's connecting the metaphysical to the material in a way that I think, well, as far as I know, it's only your philosophy, your eyes that allows. We started with the fundamental democracy of objects, the idea that a pebble, a person, and a parliament all possesses a hidden depth. And then we brought this radical idea to bear on the vibrant, chaotic, and somehow beautiful reality of Indonesia. We saw how OOO doesn't just describe a universe of isolated objects, but provides a lens to see Indonesia itself as a singular, complex object. So I think, as a personal remarks from me, your idea is also a metaphysical diving bell. The idea, your idea is not, it is not us Indonesian. It is not us, we as Indonesian, to break, and it led us not to break Indonesian down into its component parts, its GDP, its voter turnout, its deforestation rates. Instead, your ideas, it's already provided a vessel to the descent into the mysterious depth of Indonesia as a whole, to appreciate that its reality is not just the sum of its data, but the one unified object that forever recedes from our full grasp, yet whose effects are everywhere felt. For this profound tool, and also for the courage to, I think, to assert the reality is deeper than our relations to it, and also for your generous presence here today night. We are deeply grateful, Professor Harman. Once again, thank you so much, Professor Harman, and thank you so much for all of you, also my colleagues Afif, and also some of my friends from Humans Project who already make this discussion a very, very wonderful. Thank you so much for this illuminating discussion. Good evening, my friends, and also good morning, Professor Harman. Thank you so much. We're looking forward for next discussion, of course, and we're waiting in Indonesia, Professor Harman.
This event has only increased my fascination with Indonesia. So I will definitely be visiting you sometime.
Thank you so much. We're waiting you here, Professor Harman. Thank you so much. Have a great day today, Professor Harman.
Thank you.
And also have a great rest to my Indonesian friends. Good night.
Have a good sleep. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.